Second keynote for this morning is the APSAD Early Career Researcher winner, Dr. Sarah Larney. Sarah is an NHMRC Early Career Research Fellow at NDARC and a Research Associate at Brown University Medical School. Her research interests are opioid dependence and its treatment and infectious diseases amongst people who inject drugs. Will you please welcome Dr. Sarah Larney.
Thank you, Matt. So I would like to thank APSAD, of course, for giving me this opportunity to present on the big stage and talk about prisons, and also acknowledge just the funders of some of the research I'll be talking about today, so NHMRC and the Australian Institute of Criminology. Thank you. So given I'm presenting the early career address, it seems I should tell you a bit about the people I've worked with and who have shaped my research. So I came to the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre as a research assistant in 2005. And I was working for Kate Dolan on a range of projects looking at drug use in prisons. And my contract was for 5 months, but I stayed for 7 years in that particular iteration. And then in 2007, Kate convinced me to enrol in a PhD, which was a decision I didn't really think about a great deal before I did it. And I was looking at post-release outcomes of opioid-dependent prisoners, and Alex Wodak and Lucy Burns were my co-supervisors. After my PhD, I spent a year working at the Centre for Health Research in Criminal Justice at Justice Health in New South Wales. And then in 2011, I was awarded an NHMRC Early Career Fellowship. And it was one of the overseas fellowships. And so I was to spend the first 2 years at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. So if you're unfamiliar with Rhode Island, this is it here in this little circle in the northeast of the US. It's not actually an island. It is the smallest state in the Union, and you can drive across it in 45 minutes. It's very pretty. It's quite small, very pretty in spring and fall, but it is New England, so sometimes this happens and you can't leave your house for 3 days. And at Brown, I was based in the Infectious Diseases Department at the Faculty of Medicine. And I'd gone to Brown because I knew they had projects looking at opioid substitution therapy in prison and improving access. But they also did a lot of work on hepatitis C, so I became quite interested in that, and I will be talking a little bit about some of that today. And I did work very hard at Brown, but I also had a fantastic time travelling around the US. So if you are a PhD student or recently completed your PhD, I do encourage you to look at the overseas fellowships that NHMRC offers. It's obviously great for you and your research program, but it's also just a great personal opportunity as well. And then I returned to NDARC in April this year. Mostly working with Louisa, Lucy Burns and Natasha Gisev, who is another postdoc at NDARC. And much of the work that I'll be presenting today is based on a large data linkage study of opioid dependence, imprisonment and mortality that we've been working on. So my research has generally focused on drug use, especially opioid use among prisoners, and ways of addressing the harms that are associated with the incarceration of people who use and inject drugs. And the reason I focus on prison is actually a bit contradictory. I focus on prison because they're not actually separate from the wider community. People who are currently in prison were not in prison at some point, and most of the people who are in prison now will probably be out sooner or later, most likely sooner. And people in prisons are perhaps the most marginalised people in our community. They're usually from backgrounds of poverty and multiple disadvantage. Indigenous people are heavily overrepresented, and they have extremely poor health across the range of physical and mental illness. But people don't really care because they've convinced themselves that if someone is in prison, they're a bad person and they don't really deserve anything else. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that later. So in much of the world, and Australia is no exception, the majority of people in prison have a history of illicit drug use. Around half of men and women report daily illicit drug use in the 12 months prior to incarceration. And nearly half of the people entering prisons have a history of injecting, although that varies widely between the states and territories, you can see there. So against this background of high prevalence of substance use among prisoners, I'm going to talk about some of the harms that are associated with incarceration of people who use and inject drugs and how we can address those harms. And I'm going to structure this so that we follow the chronology of incarceration. So first looking at risks on entry to prison, then moving on to those harms that are experienced during your time in prison for the bulk of the time. And then finally, risks at time of release and immediately after. And to end, I'm just going to talk a bit about issues of equity and access to harm reduction in prisons. So first, on entry, harms on entry to prison. It is a bit of a grim presentation. The primary harm we see at this point is suicide. Suicides occur much more often in prison than they do outside prisons. And that's at least partly due to the high prevalence of risk factors for suicide in the prisoner population. So things like substance use disorders, mental illness, and also high impulsivity. But then as well as these familiar risk factors, there's also things that are specific to prisons. So things like being on remand versus sentence. Remand prisoners are more likely to commit suicide, and single occupancy cells. But a really important point is that the first week of incarceration has been identified as a period of particular suicide risk. And this is remarkably consistent across countries. In the UK and in Australia, 1 in 10 suicides in prison occur in the first 24 hours of incarceration, and 1 in 3 of all suicides in prison are in the first week of incarceration. And then it seems that prisoners with substance use disorders are particularly likely to commit suicide in this first week. Of all drug-dependent prisoners who commit suicide in prison, more than half do so in the first week. And the experience of withdrawal or anticipating withdrawal has been implicated in this. So it seems like the general distress and hopelessness of being in prison, plus the distress of withdrawal, can trigger suicide attempts in vulnerable people. And we know that opioid substitution therapy, so buprenorphine, phenol, methadone maintenance, alleviates and prevents withdrawal. And so we wanted to see if OST in the first weeks of incarceration can actually help to reduce that mortality. So for this study, we used routinely collected administrative data from New South Wales Ministry of Health and Corrective Services New South Wales to identify a cohort of nearly 17,000 opioid-dependent people who had been in prison in New South Wales between 2000 and 2012. The data were linked to the National Death Index, and then we looked at all-cause deaths in the first 4 weeks, and then some specific unnatural causes of deaths, so suicides, overdoses, accidental injuries, and violent deaths. So keep in mind these are only prisoners with a history of opioid dependence, and of the cohort, 17 died in the first week of going into prison, and 10 of these were confirmed suicides. But here I've split the deaths by whether the decedent was in OST at the time of death. So the purple icons are deaths out of treatment, and the green is the one death that occurred in treatment. So of those 17 opioid-dependent people who died in the first week of prison, only one was actually in treatment at the time of death. And then looking at the mortality rates, you can see the out-of-treatment rates are much higher than in-treatment rates. So for all-cause deaths, so we've got almost 13 deaths per 100 person years. So is it 100 or 1,000? Per 1,000 person years, sorry, in treatment, out of treatment, compared to less than 1 death per 1,000 person years in treatment. And then you see that disparity across the unnatural causes and the suicide as well. And then in our adjusted analyses, OST in the first 4 weeks of incarceration virtually eliminates unnatural deaths in opioid-dependent prisoners. So the reduction in risk was 93%. That's a very wide confidence interval, but even at the upper end, it's still a halving of risk of death among newly incarcerated opioid-dependent people in the presence of OST. And then looking at harms during incarceration, although still staying with death for a bit, Suicides can obviously occur at any time during incarceration, but another cause of death, of course, of concern is overdose in prison. So although overdose mortality is greatly reduced while in prison, drugs do make their way in and people do have overdoses. So the New South Wales coroner recently investigated the death of Tracy Lee Brannigan, who died of a heroin overdose while in custody in 2013. Tracy had been in prison since 2010, so this was not about drugs that she'd taken prior to arriving. It was not about drugs she had on her when she was in prison and when she arrived in prison. And she'd also had 4 non-fatal overdoses just in this incarceration. So clearly there are drugs in prison and people do have overdoses and die. Looking at that cohort, the in-prison cohort again of opioid-dependent people, and this time we looked at deaths across all time spent in prison. There were 51 deaths and more than a third were confirmed suicides, but there were also 6 drug overdoses. And then again looking at deaths by treatment status. So purple is deaths out of treatment and green is the deaths in treatment. So again, most of the deaths are occurring when people are not in OST. And in fact, all of the overdose deaths were in people who were not in OST. And then again, the higher mortality rates out of treatment compared to in treatment. And then in the adjusted analysis for all time in prison, again, a very strong association between opioid substitution therapy and reduced risk of unnatural death. As I said before, still very wide confidence intervals, but at least a 65% reduction in mortality risk for opioid-dependent people in prison who are in OST. So death is obviously the major harm that can occur during incarceration, but there are other risks associated with prison if you're drug dependent, particularly if you inject. We know from many studies that a substantial proportion of people who inject drugs will do so while they're incarcerated. How many people do that varies very widely by country, depends on a whole range of factors. In some studies it's a very small proportion, in others it's more than half. The point is some people will inject in prison and more so heroin users than stimulant, so cocaine or amphetamine users. And this is what you're injecting with. Has that come up pretty good? Syringes in prison are cut down to assist with smuggling them in. They're obviously quite dirty. The needles are blunt and bent. You can imagine the kind of soft tissue damage and vein damage that injecting with a needle is going to cause with a needle like that. And in prison, people do tend to inject less frequently than they did outside, but each injecting occasion has a much higher risk attached to it because people are far more likely to be sharing works. And because the prisoner population is quite dynamic, chances are that you're going to be sharing with a slightly different group of people each time you inject. And so these are prime conditions for transmission of bloodborne viruses, of course. The most common bloodborne virus in prison is hepatitis C. Louisa and I and colleagues completed a systematic review of hepatitis C prevalence and incidence in prisons last year. And we estimated that global hepatitis C antibody prevalence among people in prisons is 26%, and that's compared to a general population prevalence of 3%. And the strongest predictor of hepatitis C in the samples that we looked at was the proportion of the sample that had been injecting. And looking specifically at prisoners who inject, we estimated that 63% globally were hepatitis C antibody positive. We also looked at risk of hepatitis C seroconversion while incarcerated. It's low, but it's not zero. There is a risk of acquiring hepatitis C while in prison, and that is related mostly to injecting drug use and possibly also to tattooing, although it's very difficult to tease those things out, of course. HIV is less prevalent than hepatitis C, but transmission in prison has been documented. There have been HIV outbreaks or clusters specifically related to injecting drug use in Scotland, Lithuania, Russia, Australia, a few others. The Lithuanian outbreak in 2002 almost doubled the number of diagnosed HIV cases in the entire country. So outside prison, we know what to do about this. We give people sterile needles and syringes to inject with. We've done that in Australia since the mid-80s. We've done it very well, or quite well. Some countries have also established NSPs in prisons. So Switzerland had the first prison NSP in 1992. And there are now NSPs in at least one correctional facility in each of these countries. And you can see this is not necessarily about rich countries. It's not necessarily about countries that are the most progressive. Unfortunately, the Australian success in implementing NSP in the community has not been mirrored in prisons. In 2012, the ACT government approved an NSP trial in the Alexander McConaughey Centre, the ACT's only correctional centre. But despite the hard work of many people, chief among them Michael Levy, the trial is still not underway. The Prison Officers Union, the CPSU, is adamantly opposed to the NSP, as you can see at a protest here outside the prison in September this year. The CPSU opposition is based in their belief that an NSP would lead to needles and syringes being used as weapons against prison officers. And they often cite the case of Jeff Pearce, who was a prison officer in New South Wales who was stabbed with a needle. He did acquire HIV and later died. But this happened in a prison without an NSP. So in opposing the prison NSP, the CPSU is actually defending the status quo, which is a situation where you have needles in prison and they are unregulated. So it's not as if prisons are safe because of the lack of an NSP. The needles are in there, and prison officers do get needle stick injuries under current conditions, especially during cell searches, where they're stuck with needles that have been hidden under ledges and places like that. Under a regulated NSP, needles would not need to be hidden, and that risk of accidental needle stick injury would be removed. And I will come to the argument about needles being used as weapons again shortly. When we look at the research on prison NSP, it's very difficult to evaluate the effect of NSP on HIV or hepatitis C seroconversion directly because they are rare events. You need very large sample size. So instead, studies usually focus on the risk behaviours that lead to infections. And the evidence is that sharing of injecting equipment substantially declines in the presence of an NSP. And although we usually focus on that important outcome of infectious diseases, it's also worth noting that abscesses decline when there's an NSP in prison. It's also important to note that there is a lack of evidence of harm associated with NSP in prison. If there was evidence of harm, we would know about it. It would be shouted from the rooftops. But there has not been any evidence of uptake of injecting among previously drug-naive people. There has been no evidence of needles being used as weapons against officers. And these are the principal objections against NSP in prison. If these things were happening, then the existing prison NSPs would have been shut down. But the only country that has ever closed a prison NSP is Germany. And those closures were associated with the election of a new government that was opposed to them. No prison NSP has ever been closed because of health and safety concerns. Going back to OST, OST can also have a role in HIV and hepatitis C prevention in prisons. HIV prevention specifically has been mentioned as the primary rationale for introducing OST in some correctional settings. For example, Indonesia launched a national strategy for HIV prevention, care and support for prisoners in 2005, and that included methadone maintenance as an important aspect of HIV prevention. So I have some happy snaps from Indonesian prisons. This one is a narcotic prison in Jakarta. So all the people held here are either drug users or drug dealers. They're all in there for drug-related crime. And this is the actual methadone dosing in the clinic. So this is the nurse. She's got her records of who is on treatment and how much. Methadone bottle with the measuring pump, and then there's the jug of cordial to dilute the dose as part of preventing diversion. So she just measures out the dose, tops up the cup with some cordial, and the patient takes their dose. And then this is in Karabakan prison in Bali, until recently home to Chappelle Corby, and currently the Bali 9, plus 1,000 other people. And then this very pretty looking wing is actually the death penalty wing. And then this is their clinic, and this is the first clinic in prison in all of Asia to provide methadone maintenance. And as I said, it's very hard to show the impact of a program on actual seroconversion. So instead we look for changes in risk behaviours. So a few years ago, as part of my PhD, I did a systematic review looking at the question of OST and HIV prevention in prisons, and there were several studies that demonstrated that injecting risk behaviours in prison are significantly reduced while someone is in OST. Not long after that, Kate Dolan reported that hepatitis C seroconversion in prison was associated with current opioid substitution. And that's not what you would expect, and she was quite concerned about writing this up, as you can imagine. There's nothing causal about the result. Being in OST in prison does not make you more likely to contract hepatitis C, but there was an association. And so Kate suggested that perhaps OST was a marker for people who are already at greater risk inside prison. So if you're injecting in prison, that is when you are going to get into treatment. And so people who are at risk are in treatment. So that seems quite plausible, but it's obviously something that needs to be looked at further. And this brings us to harms following release from prison. So once someone gets through their time in prison, we see another period of particularly high mortality risk, this time the first few weeks after release. And much of this risk is due to overdose deaths. So in the first 2 weeks after release, the risk of fatal overdose is 3 to 8 times greater than in the later weeks at other times at liberty. And it's generally attributed to loss of opioid tolerance that occurs when opioid use ceases or dramatically decreases while in prison. And what this means is that 1 in 200 opioid-dependent people released from prison will die within 1 month of release. The potential of take-home naloxone for people leaving prisons to reduce overdose deaths is being explored. Naloxone is an opioid antagonist that counteracts respiratory depression in overdose. It's increasingly being supplied to emergency services, including police officers in a lot of countries, and also directly to opioid users and their friends and families to administer in the event of an overdose. So people leaving prisons with their very elevated overdose risk are an ideal group to give naloxone. In English prisons, there's a huge randomised controlled trial, the N-Alive trial, underway to look at the impact of post-release naloxone on overdoses. And this is the kit that people in the naloxone arm of the study are given as they leave. It's an intramuscular injection, and there's also a card with instructions on how to use the naloxone. And people can just pop their cards or whatever in there as well, so it's very practical and unobtrusive for someone to have on them. It was planned that N-Alive would also include prisons in other parts of the UK, but Scotland and Wales have actually gone ahead and now routinely offer naloxone to at-risk people leaving prison. And Scotland gave out 746 kits in 2012-13. And this just came out a week or two ago, some emerging evidence that the number of post-release deaths may be coming down in Scotland. So this is from an NHS report on the National Naloxone Distribution Program, specifically looking at deaths in the 4 weeks after release from prison. So the red lines are the baseline indicator with confidence intervals. So the middle one is the baseline indicator and then the confidence intervals. And that's the average percentage of opioid-related deaths that occurred after release from prison between 2006 and 2010. And then the program started in 2011. And then you can see that the 2012-2013 figures are well below the baseline indicator. Obviously, it's very important to be cautious interpreting this because, the 2010 deaths were also below the baseline indicator. So there's potentially other factors at play. But it does suggest that giving naloxone to people at risk of overdose as they're leaving prison may be contributing to a reduction in post-release deaths. At the very least, it's not increasing overdose deaths. A common objection to naloxone is that people will take more risks because they have that safety net, but there does not seem to be any evidence of that. Assuming that post-release deaths are related to loss of tolerance, maintaining opioid tolerance throughout incarceration may also assist in reducing post-release deaths. So we looked at this in New South Wales, this time using data for all people who had been in OST and were released from prison between 2000 and 2012. So it's a slightly different cohort from the one inside prison, because in this case they had to have been released at some point. And then we looked at deaths in the first 4 weeks post-release in relation to treatment. So this is the number of deaths occurring in each month after release from prison for up to 12 months post-release. And so nearly a quarter of those deaths occurred in the first week after release. The first month, I should say. And then within that first 4 weeks, the deaths are concentrated in the first 2 weeks, especially week 1 post-release. And then these are the mortality rates in the first 4 weeks after release by extent of OST exposure. So full OST exposure on the right means that someone spent either the full 4 weeks post-release in OST, or they died at some point during the first 4 weeks but were in treatment from release until death. And then partial and no OST were similarly defined, taking into account deaths. So there's a very clear reduction in all-cause and drug-related mortality rates from left to right as exposure to OST increases. And then these are the results for the OST variables from an adjusted Cox model. So looking at the first row, we examined the effects of being in OST immediately prior to release on the risk of post-release death, and there was a substantial effect. But when we looked at the interaction with time, it actually decayed quite rapidly after release. So being on OST at the time of release is important and protective at first, but what really matters is that ongoing retention in treatment after release. And that's the result in the second row, the post-release OST exposure. So when someone was in OST after release, their risk of death was reduced by 75% compared to someone not in OST. And that is opioid-dependent people not in OST. So as with deaths in custody, again, very wide confidence intervals, but still a halving of mortality risk at the very least in the immediate post-release period. The catch is that we do have to ensure that people are retained in treatment. And as part of my PhD work, we actually reported a similar effect of OST on risk of reincarceration. So there was OST in prison at the time of release had a short-term impact on risk of reincarceration, but it was retention that made the difference. For every day that a person was retained on OST post-release, their risk of reincarceration was 20% lower than someone who was no longer in treatment. So again, immediate post-release benefits if you're receiving treatment in prison, but it's the retention in treatment after release that ensures that those benefits carry on over time. And the way to maximise retention after release is to continue treatment in those people who enter prison while already being prescribed OST. There's plenty of evidence that it's feasible and safe to start people on OST while in prison, and that people who start OST in prison are more likely to attend community treatment than people who are just given a referral as they leave. So really, if we want to maximise engagement and retention in treatment after release from prison and thereby reduce mortality and incarceration risk, we really need to continue OST in people who are already being treated and allow people to start OST in prison if it's clinically indicated, which really is not only rocket science, it's pretty much the way you would expect any illness to be treated. Of course, all of this does assume that opioid-dependent people want to be in OST if they're in prison and that they want to stay in OST after release. But clinicians in prison commonly see that patients actually want to be off methadone or buprenorphine by the time they're out, and that's a legitimate preference, of course, and it's something that needs to be taken into account by clinicians while also trying to minimise their overdose risk. And that really hasn't been considered in great detail, but I'm involved in some work with Justice Health and Deborah Zador at the moment, looking at this issue and other patient concerns around OST in prison. So I just want to finish off my talk with a bit of a soapbox, a brief discussion of issues around access and equity. When people are incarcerated, they retain all of their human rights, except the right to liberty. So they retain the right to equal access to healthcare, including preventive care. And this principle of equivalence is enshrined in multiple international human rights instruments, including here the UN Basic Principles for the Treatment of Prisoners. Equivalence of care is often cited in prison health policy documents as a guiding principle, and some prisoner health advocates actually go further and say that we should be looking for equivalence of outcomes, and there's certainly viable arguments, a strong case for that approach. Unfortunately, the principle that often informs prisoner healthcare in practice is that of deservingness, as if healthcare is something that you must earn or that you lose the right to if you break the law. And the principle of deservingness was highlighted for me when I was in Rhode Island. A local incarcerated man with hepatitis C received a liver transplant. It was paid for by state and federal funds. The cost that was widely reported in the media was $1 million, although no one seems to know where that number came from. And of course, this led to lots of headlines about prisoners receiving expensive medical care at taxpayer expense, as if no one has ever accessed federally funded healthcare before. And there was quite a bit of anger at this transplant, much of which reflected this idea of deservingness. And this quote from a state senator, it sums it up quite well. $1 million is a tremendous amount of taxpayer resources put into any person's healthcare. So he's obviously not too keen on publicly funded healthcare in the first place. But the important part is that final qualifier. Never mind someone who is a drug dealer and a thief. And at first blush, it can seem confronting that someone in prison received a liver transplant when your friend's mother's cousin, who's paid taxes his whole life and fosters puppies and mows his neighbour's lawn, has been on the list for 3 years. But it's not about any of those things. You know, healthcare is a right, not something that we only allow for people who we decide have met a particular standard. And if we do apply a standard of deservingness, then we have to ask questions about who deserves what kinds of care. So does any criminal conviction suddenly render you undeserving of care? Or is it just expensive healthcare? Is it only violent crimes? Is this something that's part of your sentence? You get sentenced to 6 years in prison and 10 years of no healthcare, you know, or is it only while you're incarcerated that you don't deserve care? And then is it only crime that excludes you from care? Like, what if you're just not a very nice person? You know, so it's and then who is deciding this? You know, is this lawyers? Is this doctors? Is this us? Like, you know, there's just too many variables. It's a completely inappropriate method for determining access to care. And of course, what often goes along with this idea of deservingness is the idea that prisons should be punishing people, and that harm reduction is somehow rewarding drug use or making prison too easy. But the fact of being in prison is itself the punishment. It's not for prisons to dole out additional hardships, and people in our prisons are entitled to all the healthcare that is available in the community. Even so, coverage of harm reduction interventions in prison is quite poor. According to the global report from Harm Reduction International, in 2012, only 10 countries had needle and syringe programs in prison, and 41 countries offered opioid substitution therapy in prison. It's certainly an increase in recent years, although still far from equivalent to community access. And of course, there are still places where you can't get these things in the community, let alone in prison. As far as I'm aware, Scotland and Wales are the only places where routinely giving naloxone to at-risk people who are leaving prison. There are some good examples of doing harm reduction well in prisons. I nominate Spain and Iran, who both have widespread needle and syringe programs and OST and a range of other programs in place. But it's important to note that the existence of a program does not necessarily mean adequate coverage. And the US is a great example of this. In the US, people going into prisons and jails are different things in the US. Here they're the same. The people going into prison and jails in the US, with very few exceptions, are denied OST. So in almost all US correctional institutions, if you are enrolled in an opioid pharmacotherapy program when you go in, too bad, you are not getting that medication. So across the country, less than 2,000 state and federal prisoners are in OST at any one time. And that's out of 1.5 million state and federal prisoners. There's also a small number of people in pharmacotherapies in jails, such as Rikers Island Jail. But still, it's a hugely under-medicating people. There are also issues around programs that are started but never move out of the pilot phase or aren't scaled up effectively. And we see this especially in resource-poor settings where donor money is used to commence a program, but there's a lack of funds to scale up and sustain the program long term. So in Australia, we have no NSPs in prison, despite the official go-ahead for a trial in the ACT. No jurisdiction is providing naloxone on release. Some of our peer organisations in some states are providing training inside and trying to make it easy for people to get naloxone, but we still have not been able to, no one has been able to get naloxone into people's hands as they're walking out the gate. OST is available in all states and territories, but a review of drug and alcohol services in prisons found that Queensland in particular has very restricted access to OST, particularly for male prisoners. And almost all jurisdictions reported that resource pressures, so financial or human resources, limit patient numbers, and that's certainly been a theme in New South Wales for the past few years. The new frontier in harm reduction in prisons is naloxone. We need to get moving on overdose prevention, education and training, naloxone training with prisoners, and get naloxone into people's hands as they're walking out the gate. Some of our peer organisations have started with the training. That really needs to be scaled up, and we need to make it as easy as possible for people to get hold of naloxone as they're leaving. It's, going to a pharmacy is one thing on a very long list of things to do when you get out of prison, and it may not be a priority. In terms of the future of harm reduction in prisons, this might be a bit pie in the sky, but I started to wonder if it would be possible to have naloxone inside prisons. It could be done. It's not a drug that has any kind of recreational use or abuse potential. There's a few ways it could be done. It could be part of a prison officer's kit that they always carry on them, the same way that police officers in some US jurisdictions now carry naloxone. It could be held by medical staff. It could be a peer program with inmates who are trained to respond to overdoses. It's probably a long way off, but if we do have it in the community, then we need to have it inside prison as well. So to wrap things up, my main message here is that prison exacerbates drug-related harms and social marginalisation and other problems, but harm reduction can reduce morbidity and mortality associated with incarceration. For the most part, when we talk about harm reduction in prisons, we mean OST and NSP, and these each address particular harms, so it's not enough to have one and not the other. It's particularly not enough to have OST and not NSP, because many people inject non-opioid drugs and people in OST may also continue to inject. Naloxone is also coming to be acknowledged as an important aspect of harm reduction in prison, and there's a great deal of work to be undertaken in that regard, including if it does in fact reduce post-release deaths, but also around identifying the best distribution model. In saying all of this, I think it's important to point out that we can avoid the harms associated with prison if we look at alternatives to incarceration. We don't have to lock people up. But in the meantime, there's absolutely room for improvement in the provision of harm reduction services in Australian prisons. Australia is known internationally as having strong community harm reduction programs that reach a good proportion of people who inject drugs. But prisons are a part of the community, and we can never have full harm reduction coverage if we don't also extend services to people in prisons.